Good evening. Tonight we're taking a detour. We're not digging through ancient ruins or reliving long-forgotten battles. We're stepping into the hushed, antiseptic corridors of mid-20th century medicine, back to an era when a tiny white tablet promised flawless, dreamless sleep. Forget the glossy spreads of beaming mothers and peaceful infants. Behind that soothing promise of comfort and safety, a chemical storm gathered in silence, a catastrophe unfolding in the one place families felt safest, their own homes. The truth is, you would have believed in it. In a time before endless online cautions, when a physician's word carried absolute weight, that little pill wouldn't have felt like a mere option. It would have felt like a lifeline. Before you settle in, go ahead and like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy the work here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see the audience spread across the world. Silence your notifications. Take a deep breath. Let's begin. In the ash-dusted dawn of post-war West Germany, a peculiar craving took hold. It wasn't for water or victory, but for something infinitely more elusive. A full, untroubled night's sleep. The war had ended years earlier, but its echoes still rattled inside people's bones. Cities that had been reduced to rubble were rising again, brick by painstaking brick, as industry erupted with the force that would soon be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Factories in the Ruhr thrummed with raw intent. The Volkswagen Beetle was becoming a badge for a newly mobile middle class. The streets of Hamburg and Munich filled with the sounds of trade and rebuilding, a relentless forward drive. But behind closed doors, after shifts ended and shop shutters fell, the ghosts remained. Anxiety was the currency of the land. People were drained, not just by reconstruction, but by memory. They longed for peace. They longed for oblivion, even for a few hours. The tools available to achieve that oblivion were blunt and dangerous. The medicine cabinets of the 1950s were booby-trapped with barbiturates, phenobarbital, secobarbital sold under names that whispered of gentle rest. Luminal, seconal, they certainly worked. They could pull a restless mind down into deep unconsciousness. But they were hammers, not scalpels, ferociously addictive, as much in the mind as in the blood. Worse still, the gap between a helpful dose and a lethal one was perilously thin. A few tablets too many by miscalculation or intent, and the sleeper never woke. Headlines told of starlets and ordinary people alike lost to sleeping pill overdoses. Families lived with a quiet dread of the small bottle on the nightstand. Doctors prescribed with a heavy hand and a heavier conscience, fully aware of what risks they were introducing to a home. The world, especially a German society enamored with order, safety, and efficiency, begged for an alternative, a safe sedative, a tranquilizer without tears, a sleeping pill one could trust not merely with rest, but with life itself. That collective longing created a perfect vacuum, and into it surged a rapidly expanding pharmaceutical industry. For all its horrors, the war had turbocharged medical and chemical innovation. Companies once known for dyes and industrial chemicals were now giants of medicine. Powerhouses like Bayer, Hoechst, and BASF names stitched into the fabric of German industry found themselves locked in quiet, cutthroat competition. Their laboratories, stocked with the country's sharpest minds, became the new battleground. The prize wasn't land, it was patents. The goal was the next blockbuster molecule, the next key to unlock global markets. And the holy grail, the prize beyond all prizes, was a sedative that wasn't a barbiturate. A pill to soothe nerves, usher in natural sleep, and be, above all, harmless. Into this high-stakes arena stepped a relative upstart, a small, ferociously ambitious firm called Chemie Grünenthal. Founded in 1946 in Stolberg, near the Belgian border, Grünenthal was a classic challenger brand. Its first real victory was practical and perfectly timed. It became the first German company to mass-produce penicillin, an essential weapon in the post-war battle against infection. But riding someone else's discovery wasn't enough. To join the ranks of giants, Grünenthal needed a creation of its own, a unique compound, a wonder drug. Hermann Wirtz, the company's devoutly Catholic and deeply patriarchal founder, saw that not just as a business goal, but as a moral mission. To calm the anxieties of a world learning to live again. Under his direction, the research arm run by the sharp and driven pharmacologist Heinrich Müchter, a man with a carefully obscured wartime past tied to typhus research in occupied Poland, received a single crystalline directive: find the perfectly safe sedative. The race was on. The entire company hummed with a quiet clinical urgency to solve sleeplessness. They had no inkling that in chasing a dream, they were about to unleash a waking nightmare. The breakthrough, when it arrived, wasn't a thunderclap. It was a footnote to an entirely different project. In Grunenthal's glass and steel labs, a team of chemists wasn't hunting for a sedative at all. They were on a more mundane mission, devising a cheaper, more efficient method to synthesize antibiotics from peptides. In 1953, a chemist named Wilhelm Kunz, working under Herbert Keller, began tinkering with byproducts of that process. One was a neat, stable little molecule he called phthalimidoglutaramide. It showed no antibiotic properties. A bust. It was catalogued, shelved, and forgotten, a single drop in the endless sea of inert chemicals that accumulate in R&D. But at Grunenthal, nothing was truly discarded. Every orphan compound eventually took its turn in the screening line for alternative uses. And so, the forgettable molecule landed on Heinrich Müchter's pharmacology bench for routine testing. This is where the story turns. A basic lab procedure repeated in research centers thousands of times a day produced a result so startling it seemed miraculous. The compound, tentatively labeled K17, was administered to mice and rats. The scientists watched, expecting little. As the dose climbed, the animals didn't agitate, they didn't seize, they didn't die. They fell asleep, deep, calm, peaceful sleep. Hours later, they woke, they ate, they drank, they scurried about as if nothing had happened. Intrigued, the researchers pushed harder. They administered enormous doses, levels that would have been instantly fatal with any known barbiturate. Still nothing but longer sleep. They tried to find the LD-Vergang, the dose that kills half the subjects. They couldn't. By their math, overdosing on K17 was effectively impossible. The molecule appeared less toxic than table salt. That discovery sent a shockwave through the company. In a 1950s world haunted by barbiturate deaths, this was revolutionary. They believed they had conjured the impossible, a sedative with a built-in safety ceiling. It would lull the user into sleep, but no amount could push them over the edge into respiratory failure. The compound, now christened Thalidomide, rocketed to Grunenthal's top priority. More tests followed: rabbits, cats, dogs, with the same results: profound sedation, no acute toxicity. Human trials began, often with Grunenthal employees as the first volunteers. Reports came back of clean, dreamless sleep, free from the fuzzy hangover that defined other pills. The anecdotes reinforced the animal data. This drug appeared uniquely, astonishingly safe. In that cool, confident laboratory glow, the seed of catastrophe was planted. It wasn't a failure of chemistry so much as a failure of imagination. Their definition of safety had been fatally narrow: acute toxicity. If it didn't kill animals at high doses, it was deemed harmless. Teratology, the study of developmental abnormalities, was still in its infancy. The notion that a drug could be benign for a mother, yet devastating for her developing fetus, felt fringe, almost alien. The placenta was widely presumed to be a near-perfect shield, filtering out toxins from an unborn child. Testing drugs in pregnant animals wasn't standard practice or even considered necessary in that era's safety protocols. No one at Grunenthal or anywhere else thought to ask what K17 might do to an embryo. The question was never posed, never even imagined. And in that void, the drug received its certificate of safety signed, sealed, and delivered on a foundation of blissful, catastrophic ignorance. The perfect sedative was ready. The world was primed, and Grunenthal was prepared to sell. On October 1, 1957, Chemie Grunenthal released its miracle drug in West Germany under a solid, dependable, vaguely futuristic name, Contergan. The marketing campaign that followed was a masterclass in persuasion, aimed not only at physicians but directly at the public. In an era largely free of strict pharmaceutical advertising rules, Grunenthal could make sweeping claims with soothing confidence. Ads bloomed in journals and popular magazines, serene images of well-rested, happy families. The messaging was simple, direct, and repeated until it hardened into truth. Contagon was extraordinarily safe. It was the babysitter in a bottle for anxious, agitated children. It was a harmless sleeping aid, perfect for everyone, from fretful infants to stressed executives. Crucially, in Germany, Contagon was available over the counter. No prescription needed. That one decision transformed it from a medicine into a consumer good, as accessible as aspirin or cough syrup. It sat on pharmacy shelves, a friendly bottle of white pills, promising a tidy solution to modern life. Sales exploded. It quickly became Germany's top-selling sedative and, by 1960, one of the country's best-selling drugs of any category. Grünenthal had its blockbuster. The upstart from Stolberg was now a major player, its name synonymous with relief and safety. But Germany was only the first domino. Lacking a global distribution network, Grünenthal embarked on a sweeping licensing strategy, selling manufacturing and marketing rights around the world. The little white pill replicated itself under a dizzying list of aliases, a chemical doppelganger colonizing pharmacy shelves. In the United Kingdom and across the Commonwealth, the distillers' company sold it as Distaval. It was blended with other drugs and pushed for asthma, Asmast, Asthmaval, hypertension, Tensival, migraines, Valgran, Valgrain, digging itself deeper into clinical routines. In Spain, it was Imidan, in Sweden, Neurosedyn, in Japan, Isomin or Isamine, in Canada, Talimol, and, more ominously, Kevadon. In Brazil, Sedalis and similar brands. Country by country, the names multiplied. In the end, Thalidomide was marketed under at least 50 names in 46 countries, a triumph of chemistry and marketing. Then came the use that would cement its tragic legacy. Though positioned primarily as a sedative, doctors quickly noticed how well it quelled nausea. For pregnant women battling morning sickness, sometimes a nuisance, sometimes truly debilitating, it was a godsend. A single tablet calmed the waves, letting a woman eat, function, and get through the day. Relief was immediate and profound. Word spread through the medical community and among expectant mothers. What started as off-label use became a central selling point. Grünenthal and its licensees saw the vast, grateful market and leaned in, promoting thalidomide products explicitly as the definitive morning sickness remedy. A UK Ardfor Distaval boasted, "For the pregnant patient, Distaval can be given with complete safety." It wasn't just a treatment, it was framed as a responsible choice for a healthy pregnancy. Women took the pills with their doctor's blessing, genuinely believing they were doing something good for themselves and, by extension, for their babies. They trusted the science, the confident ads, the small, unassuming tablet that promised a quiet stomach and a peaceful night. Meanwhile, silently, insidiously, at a microscopic level, hidden deep within the womb, the wonder drug began its devastating work. The first warning wasn't a cry in a nursery, it was a quiet complaint from a parlor, a faint tingling, like a limb slowly waking after numbness. But this feeling didn't ebb. It lingered. A persistent numbness crept into fingertips and toes, a strange absence of sensation where warmth used to be. The world began to lose its texture, the smooth grain of a table, the rough knit of a blanket, the warmth of a partner's hand, muted as if behind thick gloves. This was peripheral neuritis, a cruel, stealthy nerve injury. It became the first shadow cast by the wonder drug. The reports trickled in, easy to dismiss. A letter here, a phone call there, from physicians around West Germany describing a peculiar cluster of symptoms. Most patients were adults, often middle-aged women who had been taking the gentle, non-addictive sedative for months or years. They'd come to rely on its promise of perfect sleep. Now they were paying dearly for that rest. Tingling hardened into burning pain, an agonizing constant prickle of pins and needles. Then strength began to vanish. Buttoning a shirt became a trial. Holding a pen turned uncertain. Gait faltered. Balance slipped. They were losing command over the margins of their own bodies. Grünenthal, cocooned in commercial success, listened with a distracted air. Their creation, according to their extensive testing, was among the safest sedatives ever devised. You couldn't kill yourself with it. A rat could gulp down thousands of times the normal dose and simply sleep longer. Safety. This was their mantra, the bedrock of the brand. Nerve damage, surely an outlier. Maybe those patients had deficiencies or alcohol issues, a well-known cause of neuropathy. The company's response was a masterclass in polite deflection. Lower the dose, they suggested. Sales reps fanned out with reassuring brochures highlighting the drug's sterling safety profile. The problem wasn't treated as a crisis, it was handled like a customer service hiccup static in an otherwise clear profit signal. But the static got louder, more doctors wrote. Reports climbed from dozens to hundreds. A few physicians refused to be soothed. They noticed that when patients stopped taking thalidomide, the neuropathy stopped progressing. But the damage already done didn't reverse. The numbness, pain, and weakness were permanent. Nerves that had gone silent stayed silent. A universe of texture erased. Internal memos show a company caught between mounting evidence and the inertia of denial. They knew. They discussed. They even began exploring a reformulation that might shed the unfortunate side effect. Yet publicly, the wall held. Ads continued to call it completely harmless, safe and sound sleep. For everyone, even, as some ads suggested, for restless children. They pushed back at any physician or journal daring to draw a line between their pill and this creeping paralysis. Admit fault, tarnish the brand. Tarnish the brand, jeopardize the hundreds of millions of Deutschmarks pouring in. So they managed the problem. They minimized it, disputed it, and redirected blame. So focused were they on this slow-burning fire in adult limbs that they missed the explosion about to erupt in the nation's cradles. The tingling was a whisper of thalidomide's poison. The world was about to hear it scream. While executives drafted soothing replies, a different epidemic quietly took root. It began in West German maternity wards in the late 1950s. A terrible flowering of human tragedy. At first, it was a statistical whisper, a slight uptick in the background noise of congenital anomalies. Then the whisper became a murmur, and the murmur rose to a horrifying chorus. Doctors and midwives, people who had ushered life into the world for decades, began seeing what no textbook prepared them for. A baby would be born, and a hush would fall. The first cry would give way to stunned silence as the team took in the infant's form. Arms missing or tiny flipper-like appendages sprouting directly from shoulders. Sometimes legs were gone, feet attached at the hips. The condition phocomelia, from the Greek for seal limbs, was so rare it was a medical curiosity. Before 1959, a major German pediatric hospital might see a single case in a decade. Suddenly, there were several each month, and it wasn't just limbs. Babies were born without ears, with small mask-like faces frozen by partial paralysis. Others had catastrophic internal defects, malformed hearts, missing organs, fused vertebrae, digestive tracts reduced to hopeless tangles. The scale was staggering, the pattern was eerily specific. These weren't random genetic misfires. The damage had symmetry, a terrible consistency, as if an invisible sculptor were carving the developing human body with a single malicious blueprint. Medicine was stunned. This was an era of triumphal science. Penicillin had beaten back bacterial infection. The polio vaccine had tamed a scourge. Science was supposed to have answers, but here none came. Explanations were hunted everywhere. A new virus, a silent contagion, fallout from atomic tests, radiation poisoning the wombs of a generation, new chemicals in food, X-rays. In a desperate spasm, some even blamed the new household television sets. The epidemic radiated from West Germany along the same commercial arteries that carried thalidomide abroad. In the UK, where distillers marketed it as gentle, trustworthy Distaval, pediatricians like Dr. Ian Macready and Dr. W.S. Lenz's counterparts began seeing the impossible babies. In Stirling, Scotland, Dr. Ian Chalmers observed 3 phocomelia cases in a short span in 1961, statistically inconceivable. He wrote to The Lancet, warning colleagues. In Australia, Dr. William McBride, an obstetrician in Sydney, noticed a similar cluster of severe defects. The mothers, he realized, had all been given a new anti-nausea drug to combat morning sickness Distaval. In Japan, sold under a flurry of brand names, cases piled up. Country after country felt the same quiet wave of malformation overwhelm hospitals and shatter families. For parents, it was a plunge into private hell. The joy of pregnancy curdled into shock, grief, and isolation. Doctors had no answers, only grim prognoses. In communities hungry for post-war normality and perfection, fear and superstition often followed. Families with Kontergan babies, as they were called in Germany, hid their children, ashamed of a calamity they couldn't explain and often blamed themselves for. What had they done wrong? What sin had earned this fate? A child's birth, meant to be the apex of hope, became a life sentence of confusion and sorrow. The world produced a new kind of orphan. Not children without parents, but parents without a recognizable future, left to care for a child with needs beyond anything they could have imagined. The perfect white pill that promised quiet nights was now delivering lifelong nightmares. The mystery was absolute. And in Hamburg, a pediatrician began to suspect that the answer sat in plain sight, in the medicine cabinets of thousands of unsuspecting women. His name was Widukind Lenz, a pediatrician and human geneticist at the University of Hamburg's pediatric clinic. He was a careful, methodical thinker with a deep skepticism of pat answers. Lenz wasn't a leap-of-faith kind of scientist. He was a builder of cases. He believed truth emerged from the meticulous accumulation of facts. By 1961, his clinic, like so many others, was inundated with infants bearing the epidemic's terrible signature. Tiny foreshortened limbs, malformed ears, chaotic interiors. He was baffled, but not resigned. He felt a duty to the children and to the devastated parents, searching his face for answers he did not yet have. Lenz began not with a theory, but with a question, asked of every mother of a malformed child. What was different about your pregnancy? He and his team built detailed questionnaires and became medical detectives, cataloging every detail of those critical first weeks. Illnesses, diet, travel, chemical exposures, X-rays, every hypothesis the anxious medical world had thrown out. For months, the data was fog-random details without a shared thread. The mothers came from every walk of life, from different regions, with different habits. No single virus, no shared environment, no common food. Only grief bound them. The breakthrough arrived, as breakthroughs often do, in an offhand remark. In autumn 1961, Lenz, commiserating with a colleague about the fruitless search, heard that a co-worker's child had been born with similar deformities. The father, employed by a pharmaceutical firm, mentioned that his wife had taken a new sleeping pill from his company during pregnancy. The firm, Chemie Grünenthal. The drug, Kontergan. For Lenz, it was a jolt of light in dense fog. He'd heard that name before, from another Mother One detail among thousands, lost in noise. Now it gleamed, a thread to pull. Lenz returned to his files and started calling mothers back, his questions sharpened. He asked specifically about sleeping pills and sedatives. The thread unspooled. One after another, the mothers told the same story. Trouble sleeping, crushing nausea. A doctor, a friend, or a helpful pharmacist recommended a wonderful new pill, completely safe, they were told. Safe even for pregnancy. The pill was Kontergan. Lenz built a timeline, a chilling, precise calendar of catastrophe. He cross-referenced birth dates with observed malformations. Using known milestones of embryonic development, he pinpointed when the damage must have occurred. A baby without ears had been exposed around day 21 after conception. Stunted arms around day 24, shortened legs around day 28. The window of vulnerability was shockingly narrow. He then matched that window to when the mother had taken thalidomide. The correlation was exact. A single pill on the wrong day could inflict a lifetime's damage. If taken before or after that critical slice of the first trimester, the child would be born healthy. It was this cruel specificity that had masked the link for so long. By November 1961, Lenz was certain. He had interviewed parents of nearly 50 affected children. The link to Kontergan was undeniable. He prepared his findings and, on November 15th, called Chemie Grünenthal. He spoke calmly to the scientific department, laying out the evidence, the link, the timeline, the numbers. He expected shock, concern, action. He expected the drug to vanish from the market. He was wrong. The response was icy denial. Company representatives were dismissive, even hostile. They questioned his methods, called his results circumstantial coincidences, and cited their own animal tests. The same tests that showed a rat could consume a mountain of the compound without dying as proof that the drug was not teratogenic. They branded him an alarmist, a provincial physician hurling wild accusations at a respected firm. They told him to be quiet, they hinted at legal action. Grunenthal's empire was built on the myth of absolute safety. They would not let one obstinate pediatrician dismantle it with a stack of questionnaires. Lenz was shaken but resolute. If the company wouldn't listen, the public and medical community had to be warned. He was scheduled to speak at a meeting of the Rhineland-Westphalian Pediatric Association on November 18th. It was meant to be a routine academic talk. He knew he couldn't, in good conscience, present anything else. Standing before his peers, he set aside his prepared notes, drew a breath, and presented his investigation. The epidemic of malformations, the painstaking search, and the single terrifying common factor in the mother's medicine cabinets. He named the drug. He named Contergan. Shock rippled through the hall. He had just leveled a direct charge at one of Germany's most popular trusted drugs. The next day, a Sunday, the newspaper Welt am Sonntag ran a front-page story based on Lenz's findings, warning of a terrible suspicion surrounding a widely used medication. The secret was out. The wall of silence had cracked. With a PR disaster brewing and the weight of public accusation piling up, Grunenthal's position became untenable. On November 26, 1961, just over a week after Lenz's speech, the company quietly informed German pharmacies that Contergan was being withdrawn from the market, blaming sensationalist press coverage and unproven claims by Dr. Lenz. No admission, no apology, a tactical retreat, not a surrender. Too late. The damage had already been done. Thousands of children had been born, and thousands more were on the way, fate sealed months earlier by a perfectly safe little white pill. Lenz had solved the medical mystery. The human tragedy was only beginning to unfold. Half a world away from the anxious corridors of Hamburg, under the vast, indifferent Australian sky, another physician felt a chill of the same dread. The year was 1961, and at Sydney's Crown Street Women's Hospital, the steady rhythm of new life was being punctured by a run of small, devastating anomalies. Dr. William McBride was a seasoned obstetrician, well acquainted with childbirth's predictable miracles and its rare heartbreaks. But this felt different, a pattern slipping out of biology's background noise. It began with a single delivery, a baby born with severely malformed arms and legs. Tragic, but not entirely unheard of. A few weeks later came another, then a third, this one with internal deformities as well. 3 cases in such close succession at the same hospital. Coincidence works as a balm until it doesn't. McBride, ever the careful observer, felt suspicion harden. He quietly reviewed the mother's records, hunting for a shared thread diet, illness during pregnancy, X-ray exposure, any known culprit for congenital defects. Nothing aligned. Every lead went cold. The hospital had recently begun prescribing a new sedative to expectant mothers, a British import sold with the same soothing assurances that had charmed Europe. Its name was Distaval, mild, effective, and, according to the pitch, safe beyond question. It was given out confidently, a modern kindness in tablet form. After delivering the 3rd malformed child, McBride reflexively wrote a Distaval prescription to help the distraught mother sleep. Pen in hand, he paused. He checked the earlier charts. There it was, the common thread. All 3 had taken those harmless little white pills. It felt impossible. Distaval was famed for its lack of toxicity. You couldn't overdose, the salespeople said. Safer than aspirin, they crowed. How could something so benign be linked to something so catastrophic? McBride knew nothing of Lenz's lonely stand in Germany. He was working in isolation, guided only by clinical observation and a rising certainty that felt like ice in his gut. He also knew the professional risk of accusing a major pharmaceutical product on the basis of 3 cases. It was a tiny sample for an accusation of that magnitude. But the malformations were specific, rare, and eerily similar. Phocomelia seal limbs, a term many doctors never encountered in an entire career. He had seen it 3 times. He took a measured risk. On May 4, 1961, he called the Australian agent for the Distillers Company, the British firm manufacturing and distributing Distaval. Calm and firm, he laid out his suspicions and the case histories. The response was polite and dismissive. They would note it and pass it on. But the subtext was clear. A provincial doctor had stumbled on a tragic coincidence. Confident in their safety dossier, the company felt no need to panic. Sales climbed. McBride wasn't deterred. Stonewalling hardened his resolve. He worked with colleague P.A. Ryan to document their findings, refine the timeline, and prepare a message the global medical community couldn't ignore. He drafted a letter, not a full paper. There wasn't time and the data was still preliminary, but a concise, urgent warning. He sent it to The Lancet, one of the world's most respected medical journals. It was just over 400 words, clear, stark, certain. He described an alarming rise in infants with multiple severe abnormalities. He noted the mothers had all been treated with Distaval for morning sickness during the crucial early weeks. He closed with a quiet plea. Colleagues everywhere report similar cases. He mailed the letter and waited. He didn't know that in Germany the storm had already broken and that his carefully worded message would become a pivotal piece of corroboration, transforming a medical crisis into a global scandal. The final months of 1961 were all nervous whispers at Chemie Grunenthal. The fortress they'd built around Contergan was cracking. Lenz's Hamburg presentation had landed like a direct hit, but the legal team managed the initial blast, threatening newspapers with libel suits and casting Lenz as a reckless alarmist. They ran a sophisticated fog machine suggesting atomic testing, a virus, any speculative, unprovable cause. Anything but their pill. The stance was unshaken denial. They were pillars of the economic miracle, with Contergan as their crown jewel. They would not surrender it to one pediatrician's claims. But evidence, like water, seeps in. Lenz wasn't alone for long. More German physicians, emboldened, reported their own clusters of phocomelia. Pressure mounted, not only from medicine, but from the press. On Sunday, November 26, 1961, a major German paper ran a front-page exposé linking Contergan directly to the surge of birth defects. The piece, rooted in Lenz's research and interviews with terrified parents, tore through the corporate bulwark. It wasn't a private dispute anymore. It was a national horror story. Public relations collapsed overnight. That same weekend, the North Rhine-Westphalia Health Ministry Grunenthal's home turf issued an ultimatum. Withdraw Contergan immediately or face a compulsory order. The humiliation of a forced seizure was too much to risk. On Monday, November 27, 1961, with legal arguments spent and public credibility shattered, Chemie Grunenthal announced it was voluntarily pulling Contergan from West German shelves. The statement was face-saving, no admission, only a pause, pending further investigation. Everyone knew what it was. Surrender. The wonder drug was dead. The news ricocheted across Europe. In Britain, the distiller's company Thalidomide's licensee was trapped. Distaval was a bestseller, embedded in the healthcare system and medicine cabinets of millions. At first, they tried to hold the line, insisting their product was different, the German problem inapplicable. But it was the same molecule. They knew it. Public opinion, energized by German reporting, turned fast. Then, right on cue, McBride's letter from Sydney appeared in the December 16th issue of The Lancet. It hit British doctors' desks like a bomb. Independent confirmation from the far side of the world, precisely the phenomenon Lenz described. The link was undeniable, the evidence international. The British withdrawal turned chaotic. On December 2, 1961, distillers announced it was pulling Distaval. Panic followed. Telegrams went to every pharmacy. Salesmen pivoted from selling to retrieving, racing among clinics and chemists to gather stock. But thalidomide was everywhere: hospitals, handbags, nightstands. It had been blended into cough and cold remedies, headache aids, and asthma treatments under different names. The recall became a logistical nightmare, an impossible clawback of a product engineered for mass, casual use. Public outrage grew from a low burn to a roaring blaze. For weeks and months, the story rolled out in gruesome detail. Newspapers began printing the first careful photographs of affected children. Parents who had suffered in private, isolated by shame and confusion, realized they were not alone. They were part of a vast, invisible cohort. The scale dawned. Not just Germany and Britain, Canada, where samples were freely scattered, Japan, where it was sold over the counter, Brazil, Spain, Sweden, country after country reported tragic clusters. Thalidomide had been marketed in nearly 50 countries under at least 40 brand names. The final tally would never be truly known, but estimates settled around 10,000 infants born with deformities and an untold number of miscarriages and stillbirths. The non-addictive sleeping pill, the babysitter in a bottle, had orchestrated a peacetime public health disaster of unprecedented scale. The house of cards hadn't merely fallen, it had crushed thousands of lives, and the world stared at the rubble, asking a single agonizing question: how could this happen? Across the Atlantic, a different story was taking shape, a story of prevention, of a catastrophe that mostly didn't happen. It didn't unfold in a delivery room's bright panic, but in the muted bureaucratic halls of a government office in Silver Spring, Maryland. Its hero wasn't a crusader who discovered danger, it was a cautious regulator who refused to be convinced of safety. Her name was Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey. In autumn 1960, Dr. Kelsey was new to her post, just weeks into a role as a medical officer at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. She held both a PhD in pharmacology and a medical degree. The job was unglamorous, yet critical, a gatekeeper on a small, overworked team of doctors and scientists reviewing new drug applications. The role required bedrock skepticism and an almost superhuman attention to detail. One of the very first applications to land on her desk was for a drug called Kevidon, the American brand name proposed for thalidomide submitted by the William S. Merrill Company of Cincinnati, which had struck a lucrative deal with Chemie Grunenthal. The file was thick but thick with the wrong things. It bulged with glowing European testimonials, glossy marketing language, and anecdotes. When Kelsey looked for hard data-controlled clinical trials, rigorous animal studies, detailed pharmacology, especially in pregnancy, she found almost nothing. The safety argument rested on an empty premise: absence of evidence. Because thalidomide was so non-toxic that they couldn't easily kill rats with it, the company argued it must be safe for humans. Because millions in Europe supposedly used it without significant side effects, it was therefore proven harmless. It was a commercial logic, not a scientific one. Kelsey wasn't impressed. Her training taught her to be skeptical of what wasn't in the file. She responded with a polite but firm request for more information: proper clinical data, evidence of neurological effects, and whether the drug crossed the placental barrier. She put the application on hold. Merrill wasn't used to hearing no. They expected quick approval. The American market was the grand prize, and Kevidon was supposed to be their blockbuster. Pressure mounted. Company executives called her superiors, painting Kelsey as a stubborn, nitpicking bureaucrat delaying a valuable therapy. It was a pro-business era, and many viewed the FDA as a rubber stamp. She was expected to approve. The path of least resistance was clear. Kelsey's stubbornness was of a different kind, rooted in principle, not ego. She read the file and found it wanting. As 1960 rolled into 1961, a tense exchange began. Merrill submitted supplements heavy on testimonials and assurances. Kelsey reviewed and found them scientifically inadequate, sending back letters asking for real data. They sent endorsements from 800 doctors. She asked for controlled studies. They forwarded letters from Grunenthal vouching for safety. She kept asking for hard proof. A quiet war of attrition played out in memos. Then she noticed a small clue almost buried in a British journal. A letter to the editor describing a strange side effect in long-term users. Painful tingling and numbness in hands and feet, peripheral neuritis, nerve damage. Merrill's application dismissed these as rare and insignificant. Kelsey's intuition bristled. If a supposedly benign sedative could damage fully developed adult nerves, what might it do to a fetus's exquisitely delicate, rapidly forming nervous system? The placenta was no impenetrable shield. Chemicals crossed it. The risk, she concluded, was unknown and potentially catastrophic. That obscure neuropathy report hardened her resolve. The application would stay pending. Meanwhile, Merrill, anticipating eventual approval, prepped a massive launch. They'd already manufactured millions of tablets. In a legally murky clinical investigation, They distributed around 2.5 million samples to more than 1,000 to 2,000 American physicians, who gave them to roughly 20,000 patients, hundreds of whom were pregnant. The company had effectively run a vast, uncontrolled drug trial on the American public, sidestepping the very gatekeeping Kelsey sought to enforce. It was a ticking bomb. Then, in late 1961, the news broke. Reports from Germany and Britain lenses data, McBride's letter, panicked withdrawals flooded across the Atlantic. In her quiet office, Kelsey watched her worst fears unfold abroad. The questions she had been asking for over a year suddenly became the only questions that mattered. Merrill, facing irrefutable evidence of teratogenicity, had no choice. In March 1962, they quietly withdrew the Kevadon application. The bomb was defused, while a small tragedy did occur in the US. Due to those samples, 17 confirmed births with thalidomide-related defects, the nationwide catastrophe engulfing Europe was avoided. It was avoided by one person, a new hire on her first major assignment, who trusted her training over corporate pressure and simply kept saying no. Frances Oldham Kelsey wasn't a whistleblower or a showman. She was a gatekeeper who did her job and became one of public health's unsung heroes, the steadfast official who stood in the monster's path and calmly refused to let it pass. The next confounding question wasn't just that it happened, but how? How could a molecule designed for calm and sleep wage such a precise, devastating war on the unborn? The answer, when it began to emerge decades later, wasn't brute force, but microscopic subtlety, hidden in the molecule's very shape. The answer began with a quiet detail of three-dimensional geometry: chirality. In chemistry, chirality means handedness. Your left and right hands are mirror images. Same parts, same order, but not interchangeable. You can't slip a left glove onto your right hand. Molecules can have that same mirror image property pairs called enantiomers. Thalidomide existed in two such forms. The right-handed enantiomer, the R form, was the kindly doctor. It did what it was supposed to do: bind to targets in the brain and usher in a serene, dreamless sleep without the hangover or addictive punch of barbiturates. In isolation, it was the wonder drug. But it had a twin, the left-handed S enantiomer, the saboteur. This was the monster that hunted the vulnerable pathways of early development. When Grunenthal synthesized thalidomide, they didn't make one mirror image or the other. They made both, a 50-50 racemic mixture. A bottle of Contagon contained the doctor and the monster side by side. Early on, scientists hoped they could simply separate them, sell only the gentle right-handed sedative and discard its sinister twin. But the body had another trick. Even if you swallowed a dose of pure R-thalidomide, metabolism would partially convert it into the S form within hours. The poison remade itself inside the patient. The calming dose inevitably carried catastrophe in its wake. For decades, the precise engine of that catastrophe remained elusive. The first compelling theory was beautifully simple: plumbing. The anti-angiogenesis model proposed that the S enantiomer blocked the growth of new blood vessels. An embryo is an explosion of construction. In the first few weeks, limb buds, the paddles that will become arms and legs, sprout and demand a surge of new capillaries to feed their growth. Thalidomide, the theory went, cinched a tiny tourniquet at the base of those budding limbs. Starved of oxygen and nutrients, growth simply stopped. Cells quit dividing, development froze. What was already formed remained. What needed to form never did. This neatly explained the flipper-like phocomelia, even complete amelia, the total absence of limbs. It was logical and persuasive, but the full story that emerged in the 21st century was even more insidious. It wasn't just starvation, it was sabotage, a hijacking of the cell's quality control machinery. The breakthrough was a protein called cereblon, CRBN. Think of cereblon as a foreman on the factory floor. It's part of an E3 ubiquitin ligase complex, the cell's tag and trash system that marks specific proteins with ubiquitin so the proteasome can break them down. This routine keeps the cell tidy and on schedule. The S enantiomer had a terrible affinity for this foreman. It bound to cereblon not to disable it, but to corrupt it. With thalidomide attached, the cereblon complex changed preferences. Instead of targeting its usual substrates for disposal, it started tagging a different set proteins that were not just healthy, but absolutely essential to embryonic development. Among the prime targets were transcription factors, master switches that tell genes when to turn on and off. One of them, SAL4, plays a pivotal role in limb formation during a narrow window, roughly days 20 to 36 after conception. It's part of the orchestra that says, build a thumb here, an ulna there, lay out the intricate blueprint of a human hand. By binding to cereblon, thalidomide effectively tricked the cell into shredding its own blueprints. The master switches were tossed into the furnace. Genetic instructions were erased mid-sentence. Construction halted, not only because supply lines were cut, anti-angiogenesis, but because the instructions themselves were destroyed. Cereblon-mediated degradation. That 1-2 punch starving the limb bud while obliterating the genetic command sequence produced the specific, symmetrical, and profound defects that stunned the world. A simple two-faced molecule, delivered as a little white pill, promising nothing more than a good night's sleep, had become a reprogrammer of life itself. Out of that microscopic betrayal and the quiet despair of delivery rooms, a roar of public anger and political will began to build. The catastrophe functioned as a global indictment of the regulatory systems that let it happen. Before thalidomide, drug oversight was sleepy and trusting. A patchwork of old laws resting on the quaint assumption that companies selling medicine were chiefly motivated by health. In the United States, the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, born from an earlier tragedy involving a toxic solvent in a sulfanilamide elixir, required new drugs to be proven safe before sale. A noble idea, but riddled with two massive loopholes. First, safe was loosely defined and leaned heavily on company-provided data. Second, and astonishingly, there was no requirement to prove that a drug actually worked. A firm could legally market a sugar pill for arthritis as long as it wasn't overtly poisonous. It was an era of profound pharmaceutical innocence. That innocence was about to end. The catalyst for that ending in America was a woman of quiet resolve, Dr. Frances Oldham Kelsey. In September 1960, barely a month into her new job at the FDA, a thick application landed on her desk from the William S. Merrill Company of Cincinnati, licensee for a promising new sedative they intended to market as Kevadon. It was, of course, thalidomide. Approval was expected to be routine. The drug was already a hit overseas. Merrill had even distributed more than 2 million sample tablets to over 1,000 US doctors as part of an investigational program, a then legal workaround, hoping to have Kevadon on shelves for the Christmas season. Kelsey didn't rush. She read. The more she read, the thinner the science looked. Animal data was sparse. Human data was anecdotal. Most critically, there was nothing about safety in pregnancy, an omission Merrill reps waved off as trivial. Then she caught a small letter in a British journal noting that some long-term users in Europe had developed peripheral neuritis, painful nerve damage in hands and feet. A sleeping pill shouldn't be damaging nerves, she thought. She asked for more data. The company pushed back. They called her bosses. They scoffed that she was a nitpicking obstructionist. For over a year, she held firm, asking questions, demanding evidence, and refusing to sign. Late in 1961, the storm broke overseas. Lenz in Germany, McBride in Australia. Emergency withdrawals in Europe. Suddenly, Kelsey's caution wasn't obstruction, it was salvation. The United States, by a mix of bureaucracy and one woman's scientific backbone, narrowly avoided catastrophe. While thousands of children abroad were born with thalidomide injuries, the US counted just 17 such births, tragic to be sure, and traceable to those promotional samples or pills brought in from overseas, but a near miss on a historic scale. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee seized the moment. He had already been investigating the pharmaceutical industry's monopolistic practices and pricing. His hearings had been dry patents and profit margins. Thalidomide supplied the human urgency. The story of Kelsey's resistance and the babies of Europe turned his subcommittee into front-page news. Public outrage demanded reform. The result was the Kefauver-Harris Amendments, signed by President John F. Kennedy in October 1962. This was not tinkering, it was a revolution. For the first time, drug makers were required to prove not only safety, but efficacy through substantial evidence from well-controlled clinical trials. The era of officially sanctioned snake oil was over. The law mandated informed consent for clinical trial participants, radical at the time. It gave the FDA greater power and longer timelines to review applications. It required systematic reporting of adverse drug reactions to the agency. It tightened controls on prescription drug advertising. In short, it rewired the relationship among government, industry, and the public, building a firewall directly from the rubble of Europe's disaster. The revolution didn't stop at America's borders. Shamed by a slow response, the UK established the Committee on Safety of Drugs in 1963 under Sir Derek Dunlop, creating a centralized expert gatekeeper for new medicines. Germany, the drug's birthplace, was slower to reform, but eventually established robust federal health oversight. Sweden, Japan, Australia, Canada. One by one, countries erected regulatory and scientific bulwarks to ensure such a preventable nightmare would never repeat. The default posture shifted from trust to skepticism. Every new compound would be treated as a potential poison until proven otherwise, especially for the most vulnerable. The rigorous, expensive, time-consuming preclinical and clinical trial system that governs every prescription today is thalidomide's most direct, lasting legacy. A fortress of regulation built atop immense human loss. New laws could guard the future, but they did nothing for the past. For thousands of families now staring down a lifetime of unimagined challenges, the real fight was just beginning. Their battle wasn't with regulators or parliaments, but with a single powerful, unrepentant corporation, Chemie Grünenthal. The company's initial playbook set the tone for half a century: deny, deflect, delay. At first, they refused to withdraw the drug, even as evidence mounted. They floated other culprits, nuclear testing, mysterious viruses, even the mothers themselves. They ran a campaign of reassurance, telling doctors the drug remained safe long after their own scientists harbored serious doubts. This wasn't the posture of a company grappling with a terrible accident. It was the stance of an institution under siege, determined to protect reputation and revenue at any cost. Accountability shifted to the courts. The marquee case unfolded in Germany, in a small mining town near the company's headquarters. On May 27, 1968, a sprawling criminal trial began. 9 senior executives and employees of Chemie Grünenthal stood charged with involuntary manslaughter and grievous bodily harm. The proceeding was colossal. The indictment ran to 972 pages. Hundreds of co-plaintiffs crowded the docket, families carrying grief into a courtroom dominated by technical science and corporate might. Prosecutors argued that Grünenthal had been negligent rushing a drug to market with inadequate testing, ignoring early warning signs like neuropathy, and targeting pregnant women with reckless advertising. The defense wove a masterclass in procedural obstruction. Their lawyers contended the link between thalidomide and birth defects wasn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt. They rolled out experts to sow confusion, contested every scrap of evidence, and insisted that by the scientific standards of the 1950s, their actions were reasonable. A tragedy, they said, not a crime. The case dragged on for 2.5 years, a marathon of technical testimony that drained families' stamina and resources. Then, in December 1970, it ended with a jolt. The court terminated the proceedings. No verdict. A deal had been struck in the shadows. Grünenthal would pay 100 million Deutsche Marks, about 27 million then, into a government-administered foundation to support roughly 2,800 German survivors. In exchange, criminal charges were dropped. The court added a stunning coda. Continuing the trial was not in the public interest, and the personal guilt of company officials was likely minor. For families, it felt like betrayal. The money was desperately needed, but it read like a payoff to shut down an inconvenient spectacle. No admission of wrongdoing, no finding of guilt, no justice. Executives walked free. A similar saga played out in the United Kingdom against the Distillers Company, which had sold the drug as Distaval under license. For years, distillers fought the family's claims, offering insultingly small settlements contingent on parents admitting some contributory negligence. The momentum shifted not in court, but in the press. In 1972, the Sunday Times, under its crusading editor Harold Evans, launched a relentless campaign publishing powerful stories, searing photographs, and deep investigations that exposed the company's intransigence and the legal system's inadequacies. Public pressure built to a breaking point. In 1973, after a bitter 10-year battle, distillers capitulated, agreeing to pour $20 million into a charitable trust for UK survivors. Similar struggles, each uniquely agonizing, unfolded in Canada, Australia, Sweden, Japan, and every country scarred by the drug. Decades passed. The children of thalidomide became its adults, navigating a world not designed for them. Funds that had once seemed substantial proved woefully insufficient to cover a lifetime of specialized care, adaptive technology, surgeries, and lost income. All the while, Grünenthal evolved into a global pharmaceutical force. Its corporate profile scrubbed clean of the Contagon affair. It paid into the German foundation as required, but it never spoke the words. No, we're sorry. No, we were wrong. The silence grew into a monument to corporate denial, outlasting the lives of many parents who had needed to hear it most. Then, on August 31st, 2012, 55 years after launch, something shifted. In Stolberg, the company's hometown, Grünenthal's CEO, Harold Stock, unveiled a bronze memorial, a small child with no arms and malformed legs. He stepped to the podium and did what his predecessors had refused to do for half a century. He apologized. "We ask for forgiveness," he said. "For nearly 50 years, we have not found a way to reach out to you from human to human." He asked that their long silence be seen as a symptom of the shock they felt over the victim's fate. For many survivors and families, the words landed hollow. An apology after 5 decades felt less like contrition than calculation. Framing silence as a form of shock ignored a half-century of legal maneuvering and PR management. It was regret for the outcome, not a clear admission of fault, no unambiguous acknowledgement of negligence, of the failure of duty that shattered thousands of lives. The science was known, the laws had changed, but the chapter on simple justice and moral accountability felt even then painfully incomplete. As the dust of courtrooms settled, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the low hum of a world remade, now home to a generation no one expected. The thalidomide children. Thalidomiders, as the British press dubbed them, were growing up. Their existence was a living postscript to the catastrophe, a daily reminder of the missing fine print on that bottle. There were an estimated 10,000 of them, scattered worldwide, a diaspora linked by circumstance. Each life was a distinct laboratory of adaptation. In Germany, the disaster's epicenter, thousands lived in the shadow of the company that had long refused to fully own its creation. In the UK, Sweden, Canada, Australia, and Japan, they negotiated a world built for 5-fingered hands and swing-from-the-shoulder arms. It wasn't simply limbs. Thalidomide's attack was systemic, a chaotic sabotage of development. Some had shortened arms or legs, Phocomelia flipper-like limbs attached close to the torso. Others had amelia, the complete absence of limbs. The unseen injuries ran deep, malformed internal organs, damaged eyes and ears, spines bending into protest. A single day's logistics became a heroic endeavor. Dressing, a button becomes a battlement, a shoelace an unsolvable riddle, a zipper a device of exquisite frustration. These children, and later these adults, became virtuosos of improvisation. Writing with toes, painting with a brush held in the mouth, typing on custom keyboards, mastering leverage and gravity, chin, shoulder, feet, coaxing a world not made for them into some workable shape. In the UK, a formidable community coalesced, driven by parents with iron will. The Thalidomide Society became a hub for support and a command center for a long war for justice. Their fight found a tireless ally in Harold Evans, who refused to let the story fade. He understood the legal settlement with distillers was drastically inadequate, a lifetime funded with a pittance. Bespoke prosthetics, house modifications, specialized care, they devoured money. Evans's newsroom turned private tragedy into public cause. In 1973, they won the trust fund. It was a landmark, but only one battle. In Germany, the fight was harder. Denial was more entrenched. Grünenthal, shielded by statutes of limitations and the abrupt end to the criminal trial, resisted further liability for decades. As survivors entered adulthood, they became their own fiercest advocates, resourceful, smart, often fiercely funny and righteously angry. People like Mercedes Beng, who co-founded the Thalidomide Victims Association of Canada and fought tirelessly for federal support. Or Lorraine Mercer in the UK, an artist and activist, spotlighting the ongoing struggles of her community. In Australia, Lynette Rowe, born without arms and legs, took her case to the Supreme Court of Victoria in 2012, suing the German successor to distillers and winning a multi-million-dollar settlement that opened doors for dozens more across the region. Their lives testified to resilience and served as a running invoice to the pharmaceutical industry's conscience. Every custom-built car they learned to drive with their feet, every prosthetic that needed replacement, every surgery to salvage a failing organ, another line item on a bill that could never be paid in full. They formed a singular global tribe connected by a single molecule. When they met at international gatherings, understanding required no words. Their common history was written on their bodies. They knew what it meant to be an outsider, a living exhibit in the Museum of Medical Failure. They fought for disability rights, not just for themselves, but for everyone, because they understood better than anyone that a society's measure lies in how it treats those who don't fit its default template. They were the generation that wasn't supposed to be, carving out lives no one had imagined and forcing the world to look at what it had done. And while that generation battled the drug's long shadow, the molecule itself, the architect of their struggle did not entirely disappear. It lay dormant in the pharmacopoeia, a pariah locked in the deepest vaults, its very name synonymous with harm. To suggest using it was to invite outrage, a kind of scientific blasphemy. Yet in the mid-1960s, in a Jerusalem hospital ward, an unlikely resurrection began. The protagonist of this second act was a physician named Jacob Sheskin. In 1964, he treated a patient suffering from erythema nodosum leprosum, ENL, a particularly brutal complication of leprosy. The disease itself could be managed with antibiotics, but ENL was another beast, an extreme inflammatory storm that produced excruciating skin nodules, high fevers, and a crushing malaise. Sheskin's patient was near death, sleepless for weeks, racked by pain beyond the reach of narcotics. Desperate, Sheskin remembered thalidomide, not its birth defect horror, but its reputation as a powerful non-barbiturate sedative. He found old pills in the hospital pharmacy, prescribed a dose, and hoped for a night's peace. What happened next wasn't just sleep, it was a miracle. By morning, the patient, who had been screaming in agony, was sitting up, calmly eating breakfast. The fever was gone. The lesions had eased dramatically. He had slept through the night for the first time in months. Stunned, Sheskin tried it in 6 more ENL patients. The results were the same, near total remission within days. It wasn't a cure for leprosy, but it was a cure for its worst complication. Sheskin published his findings. Slowly, cautiously, the medical world listened. After careful review, the World Health Organization sanctioned thalidomide for this single specific purpose under the strictest controls. The irony was almost poetic. The drug that had created a generation of outcasts became the only effective treatment for a disease synonymous with ostracism. The message was clear: this molecule wasn't a simple poison. It was a complex key capable of unlocking different biological doors. The same properties that devastated a fetus might, in another context, be powerfully therapeutic. That idea simmered for 2 decades. The next leap came from a wholly different field, led by a brilliant Harvard surgeon named Judah Folkman. He championed a radical concept: angiogenesis. For a tumor to grow beyond a pinhead, he argued, it had to co-opt the body into growing new blood vessels to feed it. If you could block angiogenesis, you could starve tumors. For years, Folkman's theory was fringe. He persisted, hunting for a vessel growth blocker. The key insight came from his lab, via researcher Robert D'Amato, studying how to halt blood vessel growth in the eye. He reasoned that whatever stops vessels in a developing embryo's limbs might be a potent anti-angiogenic agent. The connection clicked. Tests confirmed it with startling clarity. Thalidomide was among the most powerful anti-angiogenic compounds ever identified. The same mechanism that produced phocomelia was a weapon against cancer. A perfect target emerged. multiple myeloma A blood cancer of plasma cells in bone marrow, infamously dependent on angiogenesis. In 1997, Bart Barloggi at the University of Arkansas took a chance launching a trial in patients with advanced relapsed myeloma who had exhausted all options. They had nothing left to lose. The results were astonishing. Nearly a third saw dramatic tumor shrinkage. Some went into complete remission. It was a Lazarus moment in oncology. The pariah drug had become a lifesaver. Bringing the world's most notorious medicine back was an ethical and logistical minefield. Fear of a second wave of birth defects was absolute. Manufacturer Celgene worked with the FDA to build an unprecedented safety wrapper. STEPS, the System for Thalidomide Education and Prescribing Safety. The rules were draconian. Every prescriber and pharmacist had to register. Every patient, male or female, had to enroll and undergo extensive counseling. Women of childbearing potential needed monthly pregnancy tests and had to use 2 forms of contraception. Men had to use condoms. The drug is present in semen. Pills came in blister packs with stark warnings and images of an affected baby. No refills, just a new prescription every 28 days, contingent on a negative test. It was a system built on ghosts, a fortress of bureaucracy and warnings, ensuring the nightmare of the 1960s would never return. The pariah came back in chains. And so we're left with the molecule itself, a simple arrangement of 13 carbons, 8 hydrogens, 2 nitrogens, and 4 oxygens. Yet inside that modest scaffold live 2 utterly divergent destinies. Thalidomide's legacy isn't a single story, but a profound, unsettling duality. It is and will remain the ultimate emblem of pharmaceutical catastrophe. The ghost that haunts FDA hallways, the cautionary whisper in every toxicology lecture, a byword for corporate hubris in a post-war world that thought nature could be domesticated with a pill. For roughly 10,000 survivors, it's not just history, it's a verb, a daily reality. Their struggle for full recognition and for a meaningful, unequivocal apology from Grunenthal arrived only as a carefully hedged statement in 2012, half a century too late, and widely scorned. Their lives are the evidence of a failure that ricocheted through science, government, and medicine. The drug is why every new medicine now endures years of phased clinical trials. It's why we built pharmacovigilance and international radar for adverse events, designed to spot trouble as soon as it appears. In the United States, the near miss credited to Dr. Francis Oldham Kelsey led directly to the Kefauver-Harris Amendments in 1962. That single law remade the pharmaceutical landscape. For the first time, manufacturers had to prove not only safety, but effectiveness for intended use through well-controlled studies. It mandated informed consent in trials. It gave the FDA authority over prescription drug advertising. It was a revolution in public health, a firewall raised from the ashes of Europe's tragedy. The modern drug industry, with its thick web of checks and balances, was built atop thalidomide's wreckage. And yet, in the same breath, in a sterile cancer ward in Boston or a leprosy clinic in Brazil, that very molecule is a miracle, a lifeline. It's the treatment that gives a grandfather with multiple myeloma another year with his grandkids, the compound that lifts a leprosy patient from a bed of unthinkable pain. Its chemical cousins, lenalidomide and pomalidomide, are now frontline therapies in blood cancers, generating billions of dollars and extending lives that would otherwise have been brutally short. This is thalidomide's second act, its fraught, unlikely redemption. It forces us to accept a difficult truth. The line between poison and cure isn't always a line at all. Its context, its dose, its timing. A substance that is catastrophic to an embryo can be life-saving for a fully formed adult. The very mechanism that halts the growth of one kind of cell, a fetal blood vessel, can halt the growth of another, a malignant tumor. So the story doesn't end with a tidy moral. It's a chronicle of failure and resilience, of suffering and scientific serendipity. It teaches that the pursuit of progress is always perilous, that the promise of a quick fix carries a latent capacity for ruin. It is a permanent reminder etched into the bodies of a generation and into the laws of nations, that vigilance is the price of safety and compassion must be medicine's North Star. The two legacies, catastrophe and comeback, don't cancel each other. They coexist, locked in a tense, enduring paradox. a quiet, chilling lesson about the double-edged nature of human ingenuity and the immense, enduring weight of getting it right.